Welcome back. My name is Sir, and in these videos, I'm going to walk you through some of the different animation tools we have available to us in Unreal Engine. We're going to be using the ACOM animation sample project to dive into some files. And a quick reminder that if you're just joining us, this is technically the third set of videos in this series. So if you want to get a little bit more introductory stuff, be sure to check out the videos that have come before. Now, let's go ahead and dive in to Unreal Engine. In this video, I'm going to walk you through some of the different features and tools we have inside of Unreal's curve editor to adjust our splines while we're animating, including some of the shiny new features that were introduced in 5.6. So right now I'm in shot 10, that is inside the episodes folder, intro beta, shot 10 here, and this is the level sequence that I'm in. So here we've got the character Beta brushing his teeth, hanging out, and eventually being notified that there are some robots breaking into the compound. Now in this particular shot, I am actually looking at the control rig subsequence. I've talked about this in some previous videos, but I've muted the baked animation clip and I'm looking at the control rig subsequence, which is what allows me to see the actual rig driving the character. So right off the bat, I'm going to go ahead and grab maybe the head control and we'll take a look at the curve editor for this. So here I've got the head control, I've got the different keyframes that have been used to animate the character, and here I'll click on my curve editor button. So here you can see we have some back and forth on the rotate Z control, just doing a little bit of the, this motion back and forth since he's brushing his teeth. So right off the bat, we can take a look at some of the stuff in our curve editor. I'll look at the anim details panel over here on the right, and I'll filter the head control by rotation Y and rotation Z. And we can see that there are two curves, each with their own keyframes. Now, in this particular case, you can see that the rotation in Y has a much smaller change over here. This channel is responsible for sort of the tilt of the head, where the blue one, rotate Z, is this side-to-side motion. Now, if you're ever looking at a bunch of different channels, just like we're looking at these two here, you'll notice that sometimes the curves can be really large and take up a lot of the vertical space, and others might have smaller changes with smaller numbers, and therefore they end up being a smaller percentage of your vertical space of your screen real estate. So if I go over to the View tab, I can switch the view mode from Absolute mode, which has both of these curves share a graph where 0 is a consistent spot on this entire graph, and the keyframes are plotted along those points. I can switch this view from Absolute mode to something like Normalized mode. And what that will do is maximize the vertical screen space for each of these controls. Rotation in Y takes as much vertical space as possible. Rotation in Z does the same. And when I have them both selected, they're no longer sharing a true 0 and like plot graph for these different splines. It's now just taking anything I have selected and maximizing its vertical space within the window. So it's called relative mode in Maya. It's called normalized mode here in Unreal, and it gives us a quick and easy way to see whatever we have selected just blown up so we can actually see the data play out at the same time. Or maybe you've got a bunch of stuff and you want to see them independently, not overlapping like we have here. And that's one more view mode. We can go back to the stacked view mode, and now you can see the label and individual drawings of each curve we have selected. If I grab all these other ones, you'll see that we have a bunch of different things to scroll through, although most of these don't actually have animation on them. So I'll go back to the two I have here. Anyways, I'll go back over here, maybe grab a hand control, and we can see we have a little bit more data. Here we've got 3 different location or transformation curves to look at, and then we've got some rotation values as well. Just paint select in my anim details, you can see that we've got a bunch of different curves to look at. And here's a great example of using the view mode to plot everything on absolute. But if you are having a hard time seeing these different curves and you're having to zoom in using Alt and Shift and right mouse click to actually see, this detail and this wiggliness here, then maybe going to the normalized mode will help, because now everything gets to take just a little bit more screen space to draw its curves. Now for actually editing these curves, we've got a few different ways we can do this. I'll just start with my 3 rotation channels just so we can see this a little bit easier. If I want to move keyframes, I can, marquee select, I can middle mouse, click and drag to indirectly move these things around. I can hold Shift to make sure that I'm not just moving a key freely, but if I hold Shift and go up and down, it'll lock it to the vertical axis. If I hold Shift while middle mouse dragging sideways, I can lock it horizontally. Similar things to Maya. This is kind of what animators are looking for, right? The same behaviors that we are used to and comfortable with. But we have a lot of other powerful tools as well. For example, let me go ahead and switch this back to absolute mode. Now, if I take a look at the spline of rotation X, there may be times where I want to manually adjust these things, and there may be times I want to use some tools to help me shape this curve a little bit faster. Some of those modes, for example, are here inside this selection dropdown. There are a bunch of different tools available to us. So if I select some of these keys and just have them here, Unreal is assuming that I can just kind of middle mouse drag, move them around, do whatever I'm going to do. But if I switch the selection mode over to transform, you'll see that we get a little box selection tool. Now, this is not a lattice, this is a scaling box, and it'll scale from this, by default, center anchor point. So if I go ahead and try to move one of these points, you'll see that the entire curve will scale from that center point. Now this point can be moved. I can shift it over here, maybe up into the corner. And now when I do my scaling, it'll actually scale from that spot, which is very handy. If I hold Control, it'll show me some of the fall off options, and you can see that I'm kind of changing the feathering for this selection. There's a bunch of this stuff here in the tool options as well, of upper, lower, left, right, bounds, scaling, and the actual fall off. So if you're trying to adjust your scaling and you're transforming these keys as a whole, you have some really interesting options to do that. But let's keep going because we've got some newer and more exciting options, such as jumping ahead to the Lattice tool. The Lattice tool will give you independent control of each point on this box. So I can go ahead and move this corner, and you'll see that I can move the entire curve, sort of skew it from that one point. So I'm no longer scaling from a specific pivot point, I'm more skewing the entire curves based on my selection. I can grab these edges as well, and I can sort of pull the whole thing up if I want to skew the angle. And wherever I'm at, if I double click on one of the edges, it will collapse the keys to match that edge, which can be very, very helpful, especially if you're trying to just zero something out. Boom, done. So that's the new Lattice tool that came out in 5.6. At the moment, we don't have a way to add additional rows and columns, but I think that's something that we'll probably get in the future. Either way, you do have the ability to just change your selection and maybe grab, a smaller subset of keys to adjust and continuously mess with from here. But I want to give you two really useful tools. If you've animated in the curve editor a lot in Maya, Blender, or Unreal Engine, you know that sometimes you're copy pasting keys, and when you paste a curve, it's flipped from what you want. The positives need to be negatives, and something that's moving up needs to move down, something like that. There are two ways I want to show you how to do that really quick. First, if I select a curve, the same trick we have in Maya works here as well, which is that if you were centered around 0, if your rotation axis, for example, were just sitting on the sort of base of the x-axis, which typically is 0, one mathematical trick we can use is to grab a curve as a whole and run a reverse math operation, basically to multiply the curve by a -1, and it will flip it across the x-axis. That works here as well, and I can show you how to do that. So let me go ahead and just grab a curve that's maybe centered more closely around 0. This will work. So here we have the location in x, and you can see that 0 runs right through almost the middle of the curve. If I were to select one of the keys, you'll see up here we have the frame number, and then here we have the value on the curve. If I grab the entire curve, one of the things that's going to happen, everything gets grabbed, therefore these both say multiple values. Now I don't really want to mess with the left text field because that's going to change the frame number, and these are all on different frames, so that does not help me. But here, if I were to type in a value of 0, it would zero out every key. Not what we want in this case, so I'll undo that. But what I can do is I can run a mathematical operation to reverse every single one of these keys on the curve. So if I say multiply equals -1 or asterisk equal -1, that will multiply the current value by its inverse. Whoop. Or multiply by -1, therefore inverting it is maybe how I should say it. And so that will flip the curve vertically, but that does not help us if our curve is not actually centered around 0. And so if I go back to one of my rotation channels, maybe the rotate X I was messing with earlier, if I were to do that here, that's not helpful because you'll see all of these values take place somewhere between -90 or so and -130. So if I were to take this curve and multiply it by -1, the curve is going to disappear. And what ends up happening is it actually just changed from -90 to -130 to +90 and +130. So it's like way, way different. Not really helpful in this case. This is a very long and drawn out way to just say, hey, with the new Lattice tool, all you have to do, if you want to just flip a curve around itself, is go to the Lattice tool with that curve selected and just double click in this blank space. Boop, and you're done. Super, super easy. I don't believe that works with the transform tool or the selection tool. You need to specifically just jump into the lattice mode to do this, but it's so quick and easy, and it'll just use its own top and bottom bounds to flip within that range. Super handy. Love that a lot. And then one other thing I want to show you is how to scale a curve using the lattice tool as well. And you might just think, oh, it's as simple as just grabbing the edge and dragging it in. And yes, you are right about that. But there is a bit of a caveat that I want to give. I'll just use the Rotate Z channel to show you this. But if I want to take this curve and just scale it down, make the whole thing faster, I'll go ahead and start us off by taking this curve, going to the filters. I'm going to just bake this down on one. So I have a ton of different keys, right? Keys on every frame. Too many keys. Now, if you've ever scaled something down in Maya that was baked down, you would potentially remember that if you try to push a bunch of keys closer together than you actually have frames to support, maybe you have got 10 keyframes of data and you want to compress it down to 5 frames, that's 2 keys per frame. How's that going to work? What will happen in Maya is Maya will basically have 2 keys that are fighting over one spot, one frame, and it'll give you a soft error. And it'll say, hey, we don't know which one is supposed to take priority. We have to delete one of the 2. We weren't sure what to do, so we're going to leave it for you to deal with. Which, might be nice because it's not going to make any decisions for you, but at the same time, then you have to do all that work yourself. Now, in the past, Unreal would kind of just put both of them more or less on the same key because it could support that math for that kind of behavior. But now it's got a much more animation-friendly approach. If I take this curve, this full set of keys, and I just want to compress it, by default, with the default settings, it's actually not going to be that helpful. If I go to the transform mode and I just take this, actually what I'll do is I'll move this pivot point and say, I want to scale it from the first frame. So I'll just take this whole thing and go whoosh, and I'll start to push it. And what you'll see is all the keys are starting to bunch up on each other, and I'm starting to get a bunch of keys starting to lump up on the same frames. And as long as I'm holding down the mouse, you can see that the curve profile is getting really wonky as it tries to sort it out in real time. As soon as I let go, though, it will sort of smart snap. It'll sort of figure out, hey, how do we reduce this whole set of keys that you have selected and not make it super awful. And here it did a pretty good job. But in some cases, it may not give you the exact curve you want because as you are scaling this down, and maybe if you're doing this with a large amount of keyframes on a bunch of different controls, you are reducing the amount of data that you're actually preserving because it's got to get rid of something. You're compressing too much. It's got to get rid of some of what won't fit. Instead of doing it that way, what I would recommend is you do the same selection. You grab whatever controls you're messing with, and this time, turn off the time snapping. By hitting this little magnet button, you are now unlocking the sort of safety net we have here that allows me to scrub and go from, frame 101 to 106, 107, whatever. I'm on whole keyframes, which we want. But if I unlock this by taking off time snapping, now when I scrub, I'm allowed to scrub in between the keyframes. So you'll see here that I can take a key from frame 109 specifically, and I can actually drag it anywhere in between frame 109 and 110. Not really what you want, right? You don't usually want to have the ability to do this because now we've got non-whole keyframes. But bear with me, there is a method to this madness. If I now have time unlocked and I grab my curve to do my scaling with, now when I go ahead and grab my transform key and compress it down, as I scale it, it will keep the exact same curve profile. And you can see here that I'm not having any weird recalculation happening while I do my scaling. And when I go to release it, the curve stays exactly as it was. This is a really nice sort of phase 1 step. But now, we have a bunch of different keyframes sitting in between our whole frames because here's frame 109, this white line, and then here's frame 110. There's a lot of keys, in this case, 3 specific keys that are all sitting inside of that one frame, which we don't want. So what do we do? Well, there's a brand new tool for this in 5.6 that you'll be able to use going forward into 5.7 and on. If you select a curve, right click and go into filter, or even just hit this button for filter, you'll find something called Smart Snap. You can also just right click and find it in the menu here, or the hotkey is Ctrl+H. And what Smart Snap will do is, unlike Maya, where it'll sort of get stuck when it has to make a decision and it says, I don't know which one you want, SmartSnap will take this entire curve, set its own keyframes on every whole frame, and then delete everything else that was in between. So it gives you your most accurate version of the scaled key, or scaled curve in this case. And just to be on the safe side, I'm also going to combine it by right-clicking and say buffer curve. By doing a buffer curve, I'm snapshotting the current state of this curve so I can compare it to the result I'm about to have. So now I've done my buffer curve, I can select this curve, I can go to Smart Snap, I can hit apply, and that is now going to reduce my keyframe to whole frames only. And so now if I take a look at it, you can see that this curve is now keyed on just on ones, on, you know, a key for every frame, no weird in between keys. And if I select the curve, I'll make sure I go into my view mode and I have buffer curves turned on. You can see what the old curve looked like with this kind of gray ghost behind what the current version of the curve is. And you can see I'm very, very close. If for some reason, you know, in this case here, it's like, oh, I wanted this to be a sharper drop off. This was meant to be, you know, very specific timing. Well, then great. Like I can come in here and I can make my adjustments and, you know, tweak my curve handles or, you know, whatever I'm going to do. But that's the new Smart Snap tool. And if you do this full workflow, make sure you re-enable time snapping so you don't end up putting new keyframes on non-whole frames. But what it allows you to do is take a curve that has a little bit too dense of keyframe data and save out that curve profile on the whole frames and then clear out everything in between. It's a really cool way to handle that situation. And I'm a big fan of the way that Unreal actually evaluates that. There are a ton of other things you can do. We've got our looping tools here, more filters, our Euler filter. I've talked about some of these things in previous videos. And in the next video, we're also going to talk about the tweener and all the different things we can do with that. So I'll see you in the next video.